Absurd creation, philosophy and fiction. All those lives maintained in the rarefied air of the absurd could not persevere without some profound and constant thought to infuse its strength into them. Right here, it can only be a strange feeling of fidelity. Conscious men have been seen to fulfill their task amidst the most stupid of wars, without considering themselves in contradiction. This is because it was essential to elude nothing. There is thus a metaphysical honor in enduring the world's absurdity. Conquest or play acting, multiple loves, absurd revolt are tribute that man pays to his dignity in a campaign in which he is defeated in advance. It is merely a matter of being faithful to the rule of the battle. That thought may suffice to sustain a mind. It has supported and still supports whole civilizations. War cannot be negated. One must live it or die of it. So it is with the absurd. It is a question of breathing with it, of recognizing its lessons and recovering their flesh. In this regard, the absurd joy par excellence is creation. Art and nothing but art, said Nietzsche. We have art in order not to die of the truth. In the experience that I am attempting to describe and to stress on several modes, it is certain that a new torment arises whenever another dies. The childish chasing after forgetfulness and appeal of satisfaction are now devoid of echo. But the constant tension that keeps man face to face with the world, the ordered delirium that urges him to be receptive to everything, leave him another fever. In this universe, the work of art is then the sole chance of keeping his consciousness and of fixing its adventures. Creating is living doubly. The groping, anxious quest of Proust, his meticulous collecting of flowers, of wallpapers, and of anxieties, signifies nothing less. At the same time, it has no more significance than the continual, imperceptible creation in which the actor, the conqueror, and all absurd men indulge every day of their lives. All try their hands at miming, at repeating, and at recreating the reality that is theirs. We always end up by having the appearance of our truths. All existence for a man turned away from the eternal is but a vast mime under the mask of the absurd. Creation is the great mime. Such men know to begin with, and their whole effort is to examine, to enlarge, and to enrich the ephemeral island on which they have just landed. But first they must know, for the absurd discovery coincides with a pause in which future passions are prepared and justified. Even men without a gospel have their mount of olives, and one must not fall asleep in theirs either. For the absurd man, it is not a matter of explaining and solving, but of experiencing and describing. Everything begins with lucid indifference. Describing, that is the last ambition of an absurd thought. Science, likewise, having reached the end of its paradoxes, ceases to propound and stops to contemplate and sketch the ever-virgin landscape of phenomena. The heart learns thus that the emotion delighting us when we see the world's aspects comes to us not from its depth, but from their diversity. Explanation is useless, but the sensation remains, and with it the constant attractions of a universe inexhaustible in quantity. The place of the work of art can be understood at this point. It marks both the death of an experience and its multiplication. It is a sort of monotonous and passionate repetition of the themes already orchestrated by the world, the body, inexhaustible images on the pediment of temples, forms or colours, number or grief. It is, therefore, not indifferent, as a conclusion, to encounter once again the principal themes of this essay in the wonderful and childish world of the Creator. It would be wrong to see a symbol in it, and to think that the work of art can be considered at last as a refuge for the absurd. It is itself an absurd phenomenon, and we are concerned merely with its description. It does not offer an escape for the intellectual ailment. Rather, it is one of the symptoms of that ailment, which reflects it through a man's whole thought. But for the first time, it makes the mind get outside of itself, and places it in opposition to others, not for it to get lost, but to show it clearly the blind path that all have entered upon. In the time of the absurd reasoning, creation follows indifference and discovery. It marks the point from which absurd passions spring and where the reasoning stops. Its place in this essay is justified in this way. It will suffice to bring to light a few themes common to the creator and the thinker in order to find in the work of art all the contradictions of thought involved in the absurd. Indeed, it is not so much identical conclusions that prove minds to be related as the contradictions that are common to them. So it is with thought and creation. I hardly need to say that the same anguish urges man to these two attitudes. This is where they coincide in the beginning. But among all the thoughts that start from the absurd, I have seen that very few remain within it. And through their deviations or infidelities, I have best been able to measure what belonged to the absurd. Similarly, I must wonder, is an absurd work of art possible? It would be impossible to insist too much on the arbitrary nature of the former opposition between art and philosophy. If you insist on taking it in too limited a sense, it is certainly false. If you mean merely that these two disciplines each have their peculiar climate, that is probably true, but remains vague. The only acceptable argument lay in the contradiction brought up between the philosopher enclosed within his system and the artist placed before his work. But this was pertinent for a certain form of art and of philosophy which we consider secondary here. The idea of an art detached from its creator is not only outmoded, it is false. In opposition to the artist, it is pointed out that no philosopher ever created several systems, but that is true insofar, indeed, as no artist ever expressed more than one thing under different aspects. The instantaneous perfection of art, the necessity for its renewal, this is true only through a preconceived notion. For the work of art, likewise, is a construction, and everyone knows how monotonous the great creators can be. For the same reason as the thinker, the artist commits himself and becomes himself in his work. That osmosis raises the most important of aesthetic problems. Moreover, to anyone who is convinced of the mind's singleness of purpose, nothing is more futile than these distinctions based on methods and objects. There are no frontiers between the disciplines that man sets himself for understanding and loving. They interlock, and the same anxiety merges them. It is necessary to state this to begin with. For an absurd work of art to be possible, thought in its most lucid form must be involved in it. But at the same time, thought must not be apparent except as the regulating intelligence. This paradox can be explained according to the absurd. The work of art is born of the intelligence's refusal to reason the concrete. It marks the triumph of the carnal. It is lucid thought that provokes it, but in that very act, that thought repudiates itself. It will not yield to the temptation of adding to what is described a deeper meaning that it knows to be illegitimate. The work of art embodies a drama of the intelligence, but it proves this only indirectly. The absurd work requires an artist conscious of these limitations, and an art in which the concrete signifies nothing more than itself. It cannot be the end, the meaning, and the consolation of a life. Creating or not creating changes nothing. The absurd creator does not prize his work. He could repudiate it. He does sometimes repudiate it. And Abyssinia suffices for this, in the case of Rimbaud. At the same time, a rule of aesthetics can be seen in this. The true work of art is always on the human scale. It is essentially the one that says less. There is a certain relationship between the global experience of the artist and the work that reflects that experience, between Wilhelm Meister and Goethe's maturity. That relationship is bad when the work aims to give the whole experience in the lace paper of an explanatory literature. That relationship is good when the work is but a piece cut out of experience, a facet of the diamond in which the inner luster is epitomized without being limited. In the first case, there is overloading and pretension to the eternal. In the second, a fecund work because of a whole implied experience, the wealth of which is suspected. The problem for the absurd artist is to acquire this savoir-vivre, which ascends savoir-faire. And in the end, the great artist under this climate is above all a great living being. It being understood that living in this case is just as much experiencing as reflecting. The work then embodies an intellectual drama. The absurd work illustrates thought's renouncing of its prestige and its resignation to being no more than the intelligence that works up appearances and covers with images that has no reason. If the world were clear, art would not exist. I'm not speaking here of arts of form or colour in which description alone prevails in its splendid modesty. Expression begins where thought ends. Those adolescents with empty eye sockets who people temples and museums, their philosophy has been expressed in gestures. For an absurd man it is more educative than all libraries. Under another aspect, the same is true for music. If any art is devoid of lessons, it is certainly music. It is too closely related to mathematics not to have borrowed their gratuitousness. That game the mind plays with itself, according to set and measured laws, takes place in the sonorous compass that belongs to us, and beyond which the vibrations nevertheless meet in an inhuman universe. There is no purer sensation. These examples are too easy. The absurd man recognizes as his own these harmonies and these forms. But I should like to speak here of a work in which the temptation to explain remains greatest, in which illusion offers itself automatically, in which conclusion is almost inevitable. I mean fictional creation. I propose to inquire whether or not the absurd can hold its own there. To think is first of all to create a world, or to limit one's own world, which comes to the same thing. It is starting out from the basic agreement that separates man from his experience, in order to find a common ground according to one's nostalgia, a universe hedged with reasons or lighted up with analogies, but which in any case gives an opportunity to rescind the unbearable divorce. The philosopher, if he is Kant, is a creator. He has his characters, his symbols, and his secret action. He has his plot endings. On the contrary, the lead taken by novels over poetry and essay merely represents, despite appearances, a great intellectualization of the art. Let there be no mistake about it, I am speaking of the greatest. The fecundity and the importance of a literary form are often measured by the trash it contains. The number of bad novels must not make us forget the value of the best. These indeed carry with them their universe. The novel has its logic, its reasonings, its intuition, and its postulates. It also has its requirements of clarity. The classical opposition of which I was speaking above is even less justified in this particular case. It held in the time when it was easy to separate philosophy from its authors. Today, when thought has ceased to lay claim to the universal, when its best history would be that of its repentances, we know that the system, when it is worthwhile, cannot be separated from its author. The ethics itself, in one of its aspects, is but a long and reasoned personal confession. Abstract thought at last returns to its prop of flesh, and likewise the fictional activities of the body and of the passions are regulated a little more according to the requirements of a vision of the world. The writer has given up telling stories and creates his universe. The great novelists are philosophical novelists, that is the contrary of thesis writers. For instance, Balzac, Sade, Melville, Stendhal, Dostoevsky, Proust, Malraux, Kafka, to cite but a few. But, in fact, the preference they have shown for writing in images rather than in reasoned arguments is revelatory of certain thought that is common to them all, convinced of the uselessness of any principle of explanation and sure of the educative message of perceptible appearance. They consider the work of art both as an end and a beginning. It is the outcome of an often unexpressed philosophy, its illustration and its consummation. But it is complete only through the implication of that philosophy. It justifies at last that variant of an old theme that a little thought estranges from life, whereas much thought reconciles to life. Incapable of refining the real, thought pauses to mimic it. The novel in question is the instrument of that simultaneously relative and inexhaustible knowledge, so like that of love. Of love, fictional creation has the initial wonder and the fecund rumination. These, at least, are the charms I see in it at the outset, but I saw them likewise in those princes of humiliated thought whose suicides I have later able to witness. What interests me indeed is knowing and describing the force that leads them back towards the common path of illusion. The same method will consequently help me here. The fact of having already utilized it will allow me to shorten my argument and to sum it up without delay in a particular example. I want to know whether accepting a life without appeal, one can also agree to work and create without appeal, and what is the way leading to these liberties. I want to liberate my universe of its phantoms and to people it solely with flesh and blood truths, whose presence I cannot deny. I can perform absurd work, choose the creative attitude rather than another, but an absurd attitude, if it is to remain so, must remain aware of its gratuitousness. So it is with the work of art. If the commandments of the absurd are not respected, if the work does not illustrate divorce and revolt, if it sacrifices to illusions and arouses hope, it ceases to be gratuitous. I can no longer detach myself from it. My life may find a meaning in it, but that is trifling. It ceases to be that exercise in detachment and passion which crowns the splendor and futility of a man's life. In the creation in which the temptation to explain is the strongest, can one overcome that temptation? In the fictional world in which awareness of the real world is keenest, can I remain faithful to the absurd without sacrificing to the desire to judge? So many questions to be taken into consideration in a last effort. It must be already clear what they signify. They are the last scruples of an awareness that fears to forsake its initial and difficult lesson in favor of a final illusion. What holds for creation, looked upon as one of the possible attitudes for the man conscious of the absurd, holds for all the styles of life open to him. The conqueror or the actor, the creator or Don Juan, may forget that their exercise and living could not do without awareness of its mad character. One becomes accustomed so quickly. A man wants to earn money in order to be happy, and his whole effort and the best of a life are devoted to the earning of that money. Happiness is forgotten, the means are taken for the end. Likewise, the whole effort of this conqueror will be diverted to ambition, which was but a way towards a greater life. Don Juan, in turn, will likewise yield to his fate, be satisfied with that existence whose nobility is of value only through revolt. For one it is awareness, and for the other revolt. In both cases the absurd has disappeared. But there is so much stubborn hope in the human heart. The most destitute men often end up by accepting illusion. That approval, prompted by the need for peace, inwardly parallels the existential consent. There are thus gods of light and idols of mud. But it is essential to find the middle path leading to the faces of man. So far, the failures of the absurd exigence have best informed us as to what it is. In the same way, if we are to be informed, it will suffice to notice that fictional creation can present the same ambiguity as certain philosophies. Hence, I can choose as illustration a work comprising everything that denotes awareness of the absurd, having a clear starting point and a lucid climate. Its consequences will enlighten us. If the absurd is not respected in it, we shall know by what expedient illusion enters in. A particular example, a theme, a creator's fidelity will suffice them. This involves the same analysis that has already been made at greater length. I shall examine a favorite theme of Dostoevsky. I might just as well have studied other works, but in this work the problem is treated directly, in the sense of nobility and emotion, as for the existential philosophies already discussed. This parallelism serves my purpose.